Thanks a lot for the invitation, and I hope that in my paper, even though it's going to be less architectural and more into planning, you're going to find some of the themes we've been discussing, and as Jeff Diefendorf already announced, crossovers, international crossovers, transnational crossovers, and the importance of books hopefully will be showing up. So, War and the City, Senso Totoshi, is the title of a book that provided a detailed approach on the theme of planning for defense. It was published in 1942 at the height of what the Japanese call the Pacific War, by Ishikawa Hideaki. Ishikawa was a key figure in the development of Japanese planning theory and practice, and he is often considered the father of Japanese urban planning. Through his extensive writings, Ishikawa was essential in introducing foreign ideas to Japan. He was also a major planner in the colonies during the war, as well as on the Japanese mainland before, during, and after the war. Ishikawa's career has many implications for the war and for the Japanese city. Largely unknown outside of Japan, the scope of his theoretical and practical achievements may be compared with that of European or American leaders in urban planning. Ishikawa himself aspired to be the Sir Raymond Unwin of Japan. At the beginning of the 20th century, like many planners around the world, Japanese professionals and government bureaucrats viewed attempts at deconcentrating the city, such as the Garden City, with great interest. Their understanding of traditional Japanese cities is composed of specific urban units, often described as neighborhoods, machi, may have influenced their thinking. And just on a side note, Japanese cities are usually composed of these different units that are not necessarily connected into an overall whole, which is also reflected in the fact that machi is used for city, and that a new word for city had to be invented when foreign concepts were introduced to Japan. So in 1918, Fukuda Shigeyoshi, a technical officer of the city of Tokyo, developed the visionary New Tokyo plan that you have on your right for deconcentrating Tokyo over the next 50 years. In the plan, he limited the city's size to 10 kilometers, a 1-hour commute at the time, and proposed the development of sub-centers in satellite cities. Fukuda's proposal resembled Howard's diagram number 5 of city growth, and we've heard more about Howard earlier in the afternoon. So he proposed open country, with the open country nearby and rapid communication lines. Fukuda, however, used the idea for a large metropolis instead of a town of 55,000 inhabitants, and proposed decentralizing commercial functions rather than residences to the rim of the existing city. Fukuda's plan remained on paper until 1923, when the Great Kanto earthquake destroyed large parts of Tokyo and Yokohama and led to a major drop in the population of the city of Tokyo, as people fled to the suburbs and the countryside. Goto Shinpei, an important actor in Japanese urban planning, who was the mayor of Tokyo at the time, took up the deconcentration ideas of the new Tokyo plan. But through the 1920s and 30s, unrestrained growth spread around Tokyo. During this time, Japanese planners continued to monitor Western discussions and to consult with practitioners in Europe and America. Fukuda, for example, discussed the rebuilding plan for Tokyo after the Kanto earthquake from 1923 with the German planner Fritz Schumacher. Ishikawa, while working in Nagoya, consulted with Raymond Unwin on his city's master plan when he was on a trip to Europe. By the 1930s, war and defense preparation led to an acceleration of urban development that is visible both in planning examples in the colonies as well as in the Japanese mainland. It allowed for implementation of various features imported from abroad. As the government, and notably the military, prepared the Japanese mainland for possible future defense, their support allowed planners to realize proposals for deconcentration and decentralization that planners had discussed for several years, but which had never found support. The Kanto National Land Plan attempted in 1936 to create green belts, removing industrial functions from central areas into satellite towns. That move was also supported by the 1937 air defense law and the 1939 Tokyo Green Space Plan, which you see here on the screen. At that time, the construction of decentralized military towns, such as Sagamihara Military City in 1940, is evidence of the urban transformation that took place during the war years. So none of the deconcentration attempts that had been tried before came to fruition until the military government was in charge and actually could put through these kinds of new developments. Ishikawa, who was trained at Tokyo University, where he graduated in 1918, went first to work at 2 private companies. In 1920, he joined the Ministry of Home Affairs as an engineer and was assigned to the Aichi Regional Commission on Town Planning in Nagoya, where he contributed to the development of land readjustment as the major urban planning device in Japan. And land readjustment is usually called the mother of urban planning in Japan. Ishikawa's career with the Tokyo Metropolitan Government spans the war and post-war period, so from 1933 to 1955. It thus provides us with a good view of Japanese planning theory and practice during the war. For several years during that time, particularly from 1937 to 45, Ishikawa, as well as many of his colleagues, were also engaged in colonial planning. Ishikawa, in particular, was in charge of the Greater Shanghai Plan. Work on a plan had already started in 1928 under the initiative of the Chinese municipality. But after 1938, when Japan ruled the city, Japanese planners took an even larger approach and designed a coastal industrial district, as well as parks, streets, boulevards, and a civic center. So in Shanghai, Ishikawa was in charge of 10 planners, and his experience there provided background when he drafted the Tokyo Plan during and after the war. And you see here on the left is an excerpt of the larger plan the larger map that you see on the right. So this is this area out of the larger Shanghai Plan. For Japanese planners, the colonies were an important study ground for foreign planning concepts. So they looked at cities that had been planned for Germany or Russia and others when they came in charge of it. The colonies also gave them the opportunity to develop and try out their own design concepts, as military structures facilitated the application of Japanese planning concepts. So planning practice in the colonies was liberated from the traditions on the Japanese islands, so numerous innovative ideas could be tried out that were implemented only very much later in Japan itself. The colonial plans thus demonstrate that the Japanese were aware of worldwide planning theory and discussions, and a handful of planners, among them Ishikawa, brought these ideas from the West to Japan, translated and interpreted them. Here is another example, not by Ishikawa, but by a group of other major planners from mostly Tokyo. And that's the plan for Datong, designed in 1939. It was designed under the guidance of Uchida Shozo or Uchida Yoshikazu, depending how you read it. And the idea was to maintain the old Chinese center here and then build a new Japanese city all around it. Now, all of you are familiar with Western planning concepts. I guess that many of the ideas that you see here strike you as rather European or American rather than Japanese. And in fact, the only purely Japanese addition is the Shinto shrine that's up here on the outskirts of the city that he proposes. So we are talking here about green belts alongside the rail tracks. We're talking about neighborhoods of 5,000 inhabitants. We have kind of satellite towns, industrial functions that are located at the outskirts of the city. And the degree to which Western planning influenced the Japanese ideas is illustrated in this design of the neighborhood. And I just pointed out these neighborhoods that make up the whole half-moon shape that surrounds the old Chinese city. And in fact, one of the planners who went with Uchida to Datong, Takayama Eika, he later, in 1962, founded the first urban planning section at Tokyo University. And in an interview, he recalled traveling, so he just finished his diploma, he took his books on Western planning, and he went off to Datong. So he took his books and used them as a basis for developing the plan that we have here. So in one example how this pans out, this is a neighborhood for Datong, and this is a Detroit neighborhood of 1931. So there's very direct influences from what he saw in the books that he took with him to what they projected to put on the ground in Datong. And probably the only real difference is that the original plan used to have more public functions, churches in these corners, which were then taken out of the neighborhood plan in its multiplied version for Datong. Ishikawa also was a prolific writer, and his books were a major conduit of planning ideas from the West to Japan. He reflected on Western planning ideas and influenced emerging practice through readings and interpretation of foreign planning examples. In 1941, he published the first version of his textbook, which would become a guideline for planners for several decades. This book includes, for example, a proposal for a decentralized garden city urban form proposed by the urban planner Robert Whitten, an American, or as Ishikawa's writing and urban plans document, the Japanese also seem to have had a specific interest in German principles from the 1920s and 30s, such as the proposal by Paul Wolff, here mistakenly spelled as Paul Wolff, for the formation of a metropolis in 1919, but also the geographer Walter Kristalla and the professor of planning Gottfried Feder. Oops. The works of Kristalla, discredited later because of the use of his ideas by the Nazis, echoed the desire of the Japanese planners to make regional, metropolitan, and urban plans. Kristalla, whose writings were introduced in Japan in the 1930s, analyzed urban services in regional context. He pointed to a regularity in the distribution of specific functions that could be used in the location and planning of new cities. It is possible that due to the political and military context of the 1940s, German ideas received more Japanese interest and led to the focus on also another German planner, Gottfried Feder, whose work built upon historic and contemporary examples, including Anglo-Saxon concepts, featuring among others a preliminary plan for Greenbelt, Maryland. So it seems, while there maybe have been an affinity for German plans, and possibly an ease to get German books, that it was also a means to translate plans coming from America via Germany into Japan. And when you look at the plan that Ishikawa publishes here and the ideas that Kristalla has, I mean, there's lots of similarities between the nucleus of a city and then the development of smaller neighborhoods, which as I said before, are very much in sync with how the Japanese city is organized anyway. Feder, Gottfried Feder, and it's interesting, so far I have not really found many mentions of him in American literature. I found one reference in Mumford, and then maybe one or two other tiny spots, but he definitely did not make it into regular American planning literature. In Germany, he's often discussed because of his proximity to the Nazi movement. In Japan, we're going to see, as I'm going to tell you in a moment, he has a very different role. So he outlined his ideas in the book Die neue Stadt, The New Town, which was published in 1939. So in that book, Feder proposed urban units for 20,000 inhabitants, divided into 9 autonomous units and surrounded by agricultural areas. Based on a lengthy survey of existing cities, he listed all institutions necessary for a small town, creating a kind of guidebook to city planning. As I said, it was published in actually January 1939. 6 months later, on June 1st, 1939, it was already on the shelves of the administrative library of the city of Tokyo, demonstrating the interest given by the Japanese to this publication. It cannot be assumed that all the Japanese read and understood the new book, but it provoked enough interest to be partially translated by the Chamber of Industry and Commerce by May 1942. At about the same time, several Japanese planners commented on the text in different articles. Itogoro, officer at the police section of the Metropolitan Police Board in Tokyo, mentioned it in an article on Nazi Germany. Ishikawa refers to it in his textbook published in 1941 and in an article of 1943. Another father of Japanese urban planning, Nishiyama Uzo, also discusses it in his study on the neighborhood published in 1942. And it seems to me that many of these writers made their own translation of the book and did not rely on partial interpretations. So since the 1940s, Japanese urban planning textbooks have given Feeder's new town a prominent place in a lineage that includes Howard and Perry, and Japanese planners often refer to this name and to his plans in interviews. Ishikawa's 1941 textbook on urban and regional planning illustrates this knowledge and interpretation of international planning ideas. So displaying after Howard and Wolf, and as well as Le Corbusier's city for 3 million inhabitants, the next one in line is then Feeder's The New Town. And that kind of selection Ishikawa maintained even in the 4 later editions, even though some of them were considerably revised. And you will find similar interpretations of modern town planning in almost all, actually but one, which is published by Tokyo University, textbooks up to today. So that's what Japanese students will usually be confronted with. This interest in Feeder highlights a distinctly Japanese approach to the creation of small units that may be comparable to the German attitude of solving the problems of big cities. The German idea of Stadtlandschaft, urban landscape, developed since the 19th century in conjunction with Anglo-American ideas, sought to transform existing cities by creating smaller neighborhoods separated by green areas. It seems to have resonated with Japanese planners who appropriated German ideas according to their own lights, requirements, culture, and constraints. It also found interest given the fact that the Japanese had few legal tools to implement large-scale plans and that they faced widespread opposition to any attempt at comprehensive planning. I already mentioned the name of Nishiyama Uzo. Oops. He was also very influential in introducing foreign ideas to Japan. Nishiyama was educated as a planner between 1930 and 1933, and he was probably one of the few Japanese planners whose proposals were based on comprehensive and long-term concepts of society. In 1942, he was examining the problem of the big city as locale for a concentrated workforce and tried to find a new organizational form for the Japanese city. In this connection, he also analyzed the major urban planning discussions in the West. And he chose materials to present without the political context that engendered them. So whether it was capitalist America, socialist Russia, or fascist National Socialist Germany, they all found their place next to each other in his writings. He compiled his findings and interpretations in an article entitled The Structure of Life Units, or spheres. And in there, he refuted all urban concepts featuring skyscrapers and higher density of population as they had been advocated by Le Corbusier or Hilbersheimer. He called the first a simple reorganization of the city without seeking solutions to the density problems, and the second a transplantation of capitalist American cities. He also rejected Beaux-Arts projects like the plan for Canberra as purely aesthetic. Also, it is not mentioned in this article, Nishiyama further objected to the monumental Nazi urban design proposals by Speer and others. So as he was looking for an idea to be applied to existing cities as well as new cities, he very much accepted the ideas of Feeder. He developed several projects organizing the city in decentralized and self-governed neighborhoods, which he called life spheres or units. Just like his Western counterparts, he opposed unnecessary traffic, but he did not criticize the city itself. On the contrary, and this is typical of Japanese planners, he tried to find a way to maintain the multifunctionality of the big city while making them more livable. He stressed the need for equilibrated growth and the existence of an appropriate number of workplaces, welfare facilities, and the like in order to prevent sprawl. Architectural design during the colonial period similarly highlighted a particular Japanese approach to design. And I think that approach, and that was one of the questions this morning, tends to be very different from the concurrent discussions in Germany during and after World War II. So in Japan, these mostly traditional styles were not as much associated with any political context. I mean, imagine that anything from since the mid-19th century, Gothic and Renaissance and whatever historical styles were only introduced to Japan. They didn't have the same depth of meaning that they might have in Europe. And in general, these styles were not as clearly associated with political opinions. So modernist Japanese architects, as we heard this morning, participated in highly political competitions, like the Greater East Asia competition. We heard about that, as I said before. So in that field, Japan was supposed to become the leader in Asia, and they tried to create solidarity among the other East Asian nations, which would have been led by Japan. And Nishiyama, just like other famous Japanese planners, contributed to the competition, but that was nothing that would tarnish his image for the post-war period. And here's the competition entry by Nishiyama in 42. And here are the entries that we saw already this morning. So Tange, often recognized as the architect of Japan's post-war iconic buildings, stands out in terms of competitions and in terms of architecture design during the war period. And while his design, as we saw, can shift back and forth between Eastern and Western influences, be it the cultural center in Bangkok or his Greater East Asia competition entry, they are characteristic of his later approach to architecture and urban form. Instead of proposing high-rise buildings, which he believed typified Western more than Japanese monumental structures, he drew on Japanese traditions of natural objects and horizontal development. As backdrop for the Greater East Asia project, he chose a natural landmark, Mount Fuji. And that's also something that we see in the traditional city of Edo, Tokyo, where street axes will point to Mount Fuji. Tange's proposal for the Greater East Asia project precedes in many ways his design for the Hiroshima Peace Center. Drawing on architectural language of Le Corbusier, the project presents 3 buildings on pilotis connected by aerial passageways parallel to the Peace Boulevard. And you see these passageways here. They were not built in the beginning. They were actually only built in the renovation of the building in the 1990s. Under the assistance of Tange. Beyond the Peace Memorial Hall, a square provides space for the yearly peace ceremonies. In the center of the area, a huge arc frames the view towards the symbolic A-bomb dome. So most of the competition entries at that time did not include the A-bomb dome. It was actually scheduled for demolition. And Tange's project, by orienting the whole project onto the A-bomb dome, made it really something that needed to be rescued or preserved. The arch in itself was never built. There's a saddle vault at that place where the names of the victim of the A-bomb are inscribed up to this day and continue to be inscribed. So if you could argue that here's an axis in the project, but this design, I would argue, seems to be rather inspired by axes that we find in traditional Shinto shrines than an axis as we would see it, say, for example, in Versailles. So the effects of wartime planning, which are quite striking in Hiroshima. So in Hiroshima, we have the center of the city where some 2,000–3,000 houses stood, which was bombed, taken, and let me just go back here for a second. So this was an entire commercial district, densely built. And it's probably the only of 215 bombed Japanese cities where land readjustment was used to clean the entire area and to make one big monumental commemorative structure. And I find it quite striking that this project doesn't happen in the capital city of Tokyo, but happens outside in a different city, in Hiroshima. You could say, well, it was the second military headquarters at some time, but I don't really think it's the point. I think it's a way to make, as James Orr calls it in his book, the victim as hero. So it's a reference to the victim situation of Japan after the war as the first and only country, city to have been bombed. And that's why the monument goes there. And there's really nothing at that same scale, or even at a smaller scale. There are almost no commemorative structures in Tokyo in regard to the war. And even if we look at the urban plan, so Hiroshima gets its 100-meter wide axis that runs in front of the buildings here. in Tokyo, while these kinds of structures were planned, they were not realized. So Ishikawa proposes several degrees of visionary plans, and there's actually a nice film showing what he wanted to do and how he wanted to transform the city. But despite his long employment, and I said 33 to 55, nothing from this plan gets done. Instead, the population streams back into the city. Ishikawa had tried to limit the number of people there. He can't do it. The pressures of economic recovery are way too big, and none of the plans that are designed become reality. However, the plans that Ishikawa draws during and just after the war then influenced the post-war visionary planning that you're probably all familiar with. So Ishikawa starts working on a reconstruction plan for Tokyo in October 1944 and later heads the replanning office. Building upon Fukuda's and other earlier proposals for a deconcentration of functions in Tokyo, he develops a visionary and all-encompassing plan. He takes up British examples. We have heard notably about the Greater London Plan of 44, but he specifically recommends the creation of new specialized centers around the city, which would create a regional network reminiscent of Kristalla's work. So he divides Tokyo into small units, and again, this idea is something we've been seeing since the beginning of my talk. So with his first textbook on urban and regional planning, Ishikawa had proposed his own regional ideas and had laid them out more extensively in a section on planning for defense in this book, War and the City. His scheme had divided the city into multiple units according to daily, weekly, and monthly needs, and strongly influenced his proposal for the Tokyo plan. So a sketch from 1946 for the Kanto region highlights the specific connections he envisioned between Tokyo and its satellites. He also translated this concept into schematic drawing based on his regional planning in 1963. So each of these actually gives you specific names of neighborhoods. His plan recommended decentralization and the creation of new specialized centers. All of them would work as a network. He suggested reducing the number of Tokyo inhabitants from pre-war 6.5 million to a maximum of 3.5 million. And that's in the light of today's 12 million. The city itself was to be reconstructed following a strict zoning concept and featuring various sub- or secondary centers. The existing street pattern was to be transformed into a network that included 8 ring roads and numerous radial roads leading to satellite towns. For the center of the city, Ishikawa proposed several 100-meter wide streets and a ring infrastructure with radials extending from Shinjuku and Ueno that would serve the function as diverse as aesthetics, regulation of traffic flow, and disaster prevention. So in terms of 100-meter wide streets, which is a recurrent theme, Hiroshima gets one, Nagoya, 100-meter wide streets are built, but none of them is in Tokyo. So in contrast to the usually pragmatic Japanese planning approach, Ishikawa's initiatives for Tokyo were clearly based on an all-encompassing vision for the city. He tried to launch his overall plan by initiating competitions and consultations for selected areas, which were in fact zones to which he had assigned particular functions. And among them, places like the Ginza, which you might know as the main shopping district, Shinjuku, today's business district, and a couple of others, which include the Hongo side of the Tokyo University. So these projects, where they were important in local planning discussions, remained unrealized, and they're largely unknown in international planning history. And many of them, when you look at them carefully, seem to have almost an input of a Corbusian stamp. So you will find Corbusian building types just stamped on these landscapes that these architects propose. One of the authors is actually the son of the planner who built Datong. So to conclude, private land ownership, as Ishikawa had anticipated, was the major obstacle to rebuilding, and only a small part of the land readjustment was realized. The major part of Tokyo was not rebuilt according to any carefully thought out master plan. The tiny Kabukicho neighborhood, which is in the area of Shinjuku, stands out as an exception, a comprehensive replanning whose realization as a discrete entity on a small scale was in fact made possible by the city's typical patchwork quality. Rebuilt as a planned entertainment district by a citizens association, the project is a reminder of what Tokyo could have become had Ishikawa's ideas been realized. So, Japanese planners such as Nishiyama and Ishikawa appropriated Western ideas and particularly selected German concepts according to their own ideas and used them to develop concepts for the transformation and modernization of Japanese cities. Japanese architecture and planning between 1937 and 1945 was thus characterized by a conscious borrowing of foreign urban planning and design ideas, both in order to demonstrate Japanese architecture and urban design skills in the colonies and in order to transform and defend the urban spaces on the Japanese islands. Thank you very much.